Can start slowly. Good afternoon. My name is Corneli Kakachia, and I would like to welcome all of you to joining to our briefing. The briefing is part of the project which was supported by Open Society Georgian Foundation. And name of this project is exploring Georgia's foreign policy and its alignment with EU foreign and security foreign policy. Within this series of this briefing, basically we're trying to discuss the issues related to Georgia's European aspiration and Georgia's also alignment in terms of EU foreign and security foreign policy. As you know, this issue is one of the 9 recommendations which EU issued to Georgia, and Georgia needs to fulfill it until end of year. At the same time, today's our topic is a little bit not directly related to Georgia, but it's kind of it's a part of the discussion where which is could be also very interesting for Georgia. As you know, against backdrop of the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, Western leaders, including European leaders, are increasingly focusing on ensuring security in Eastern Europe. France and Germany, 2 heavyweights in EU, are trying to reevaluate their approaches to making Europe more geopolitically active and providing support to Ukraine. However, what we see is that the Paris and Berlin, they demonstrated some sort of differences regarding their strategies for Western intervention. While President Macron raises the opportunity to send Western troops in Ukraine if necessary, it seems like Germany disagrees with this idea, and it seems like they don't have a consensus on these issues. At the same time, what we see is that President Macron's proposal demonstrates the willingness to take decisive action to support Ukraine and counter the Russian aggression, which is unprecedented because I remember that a few years ago, and Barbara was part of this discussion when we had this discussion in Paris, in Berlin, and also in Hague, when we were trying to have some sort of advocacy trips about Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova's European aspiration. There was not even discussion about Georgia's European aspiration, but unfortunately it took the war in Ukraine until the this public opinion and also change in European Union. And now what we see is that 3 countries, including Georgia, became the candidate of European candidate status, and Ukraine and Moldova, they are already in accession talks. So basically, this changing geopolitical situation is also very important for Eastern European, for Eastern neighborhood. Before, we all remember that European Union was considering this region as a part of neighborhood, but I think that now, because of these revolutionary changes, we see that Western European countries, especially Germany and France, they're changing their attitudes, and they also taking some sort of, at least there's an attempt to take some sort of responsibility in order to ensure security in this part of the world, which is, there's a lot of doubts how this will be, how far Western leaders, and especially France, can go about this, and what is this, what kind of posture is what we hear from French leaders in these days. But at the same time, what we wanted to do today is also to bring discussion about Georgia, but because what we see is that France is very active lately in terms of to support the countries in gray zone, especially Moldova, Ukraine, even Armenia, and we already see that French actually signed several agreements with Moldova in terms of security also, and there's also active involvement in Armenia. At the same time, Georgia is kind of out of this picture, which is also kind of a little bit a different topic, but basically main idea of today's discussion was what does this, new initiative from France means for European security, and especially for Eastern Europe, including Georgia? And how should we read this some sort of rift and differences between Paris and Berlin, which we already see? And because this is a question which is not only rhetorical, but many people in this part of the world, especially Eastern Europe, they're really looking for what could be the outcome of this, because it's related to the security of this country. Having said that, I would like to introduce our distinguished speakers, and we are very happy to welcome Ambassador Maxime Lefebvre, who is a professor at the ESCP Business School, Paris. He's a career diplomat and professor in teaching in university in Paris. He was ambassador in OSCE, and he is the author of several publications and articles on European policy and international relations. Second, I'm happy also to announce the second speaker, who is a good friend of us, Barbara Kunz. She's a program director at European Security, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Barbara is senior researcher at this program, and she's a very well-known, author on writing basically about European security. A lot of articles also related to EU and OSCE and US, NATO, Russian strategic context. Having said that, I would like to welcome to both of you, and maybe we will start, Maxime, from you. How would you see, the strategic context and role of France in this new kind of strategic environment? And also, maybe if we can start, there's lately what we hear that from German and French leaders in Germany, we hear a lot of speeches and kind of new initiative about Zeitenwende. And then at the same time, we have a similar kind of, rhetoric about the French Europe Puissance. So what is the difference between these two approaches from France and Germany? Is it kind of same thing? And if there's some differences, what are these nuances, and what could this mean for Eastern Europe, including Ukraine and other countries? Floor is yours.
How do you sum up the German approach? You say France, Europe Puissance for Germany. What is it?
Yeah, how the German and the French differ in terms of strategies towards Eastern Europe. What is the difference between this Zeitenwende and this Europe Puissance?
Zeitenwende. Yeah. Okay, so I would say that I don't see so many differences between the French and German approach. Of course, there are some elements, of debate, or of declarations, of initiatives, or maybe some analysis, but on declarations. But I think basically the two countries have tried during the past years, to try to cope with the issue of Russia in Europe, with the security architecture in Europe. For example, there was ambition to create some common spaces between the EU and Russia. There was some attempts to not to be too I would say too ambitious when it regards, for example, the NATO accession, the EU accession for Ukraine or Georgia. There was an attempt to solve the issue of the Ukrainian conflict with the Minsk agreement, for example. So France and Germany have played a quite similar role. And I think that after the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the shift, the change which has taken place is quite similar in the two countries. So in Germany, it was called Zeitenwende. In France, we speak maybe more about the end of naivety, But Macron, for example, has tried since his first mandate to try to get some agreements with Putin about the European security architecture, about the conflict. And unfortunately, it was not possible. The conflict has continued, and we know that Russia has now opened a war with Ukraine by an open, non-provocated aggression. And I think the analysis of the two countries is very similar. And this analysis is also that Russia, after its aggression, cannot win this war. Because if it wins this war, this will be bad for European security. This will be bad for the future, you know, of European security and the risk of further aggressions. So that's why both countries have taken a very clear position on, for example, EU enlargement. Until 2022, EU enlargement to Ukraine or Georgia was not, you know, a subject. It was considered as not possible, not open, but and it was a clear position of France and Germany. And now it has changed because after this aggression, it's very difficult to refuse for countries like Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova, if they want to join the EU, that they can do so. Regarding NATO enlargement, is quite similar. Maybe France is a bit more, I would say, has a more declared ambition to for Ukraine in NATO, but it was so in the last summit. I think it was in Vilnius, the NATO summit. So maybe there were some differences of diplomatic positioning. I'm not so sure that this is really a structural difference. What is very clear is that both countries must support Ukraine in this war through delivery of weapons, through economic aid. So it's in the framework of the European Union. It's an EU policy with some EU instruments, like, for example, the European Peace Facility. The idea of giving Ukraine a kind of security guarantees, in particular in terms of military support, it is not only France. It's a policy which has been defined in the framework of the G7. So I would say I don't see a very strong differences between the both approaches, the both countries, the both objectives in Paris and Berlin. Of course, traditionally, France is more focused on the military aspects because France is a strong military power. It's not scared about using military power. There is a kind of strategic culture of military interventions abroad. So maybe France is more focused, you know, on the military side. But if you see the figures, for example, Germany is delivering more weapons to Ukraine than France because Germany has more means, budgetary means. In France, the budgetary situation is very difficult. I would say also that maybe Macron has taken some personal stances, personal positions in this debate with Ukraine, but as you said, also with Moldova or Armenia. Probably because personally he was very much disappointed by Putin after all his efforts. So maybe there is a kind of personal equation, you know, in his position. I would say also that there is a domestic policy background in France, and in part it's important, you know, when we wait for the European elections, because of course the big battle is between the Rassemblement National, which is a far-right populist, you know, nationalist party, and Macron, who is a more center-right, center-left, the center of the political chessboard. And Macron, I would say, is trying to use also this Ukrainian issue, this Ukrainian conflict in a domestic context, because we know that the Rassemblement National has a quite ambiguous position towards Putin, towards Ukraine, and maybe it's for Macron it's an opportunity, you know, to use it also in the domestic context. But it's also clearly, I would say, a foreign policy choice, a diplomatic choice. When he talked about sending troops to Ukraine, his position was to say nothing is excluded, you know. He didn't start the press conference after the Paris conference about the support to Ukraine. He didn't start this conference by saying we consider the possibility of sending troops. It was a question of a journalist who asked him, was it excluded? And he answered, no, it's not excluded, because if we exclude something, we put ourselves in a position of weakness. But of course, this declaration was not so welcome in other countries, so he had to clarify this. And the position in France is to say we should not exclude anything. But I think in France, we are also very cautious about that, because we know it's very difficult to consider the possibility of a direct confrontation between NATO and NATO allies with Russia in Ukraine. I would add maybe something about the positions of the French president, which are very important, you know, in the French foreign policy, because our president in our institutions has very strong powers. It's very different from Germany, for example, or other countries. So the president, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of military intervention, can take very personal decisions, you know, or positions. But of course, you have to take into account what is the more structural position of France. And I would say there is a debate in the domestic context among political parties. You have to know also that in the National Assembly, Macron does not have a full majority. So it's always risky, you know, to take a position for a treaty, for example, which could be rejected by the National Assembly if there is a kind of coalition of oppositions against the party of the president. So I would say you have to balance the view between what the president is saying. He's the chief, he's the boss of the country, but you have to see also in the longer run what are the positions of the political parties, what is the position of the parliament, etc. It's also something which has to be taken into account when you see the position. And when it comes to a treaty, for example, the agreement for Ukraine, it was submitted to a vote in the French national parliament. And for example, the French left, La France Insoumise, the far left, rejected this agreement because they are in favor of peace. And the Rassemblement National decided to abstain in this agreement, you know. So it was also a way for Macron to put the Rassemblement National in a quite difficult position. Maybe in our discussion we'll address the issue of Georgia. I think Georgia is in a position which is a bit similar to Ukraine. Of course, there is no war, and that's fortunate. But you have a country where two provinces have declared secessions with the support of Russia. It's difficult to imagine that Georgia could enter NATO with this unachieved, you know, territorial integrity. So there are very similar positions. And I think, of course, for a country like your country, Georgia, it's very interesting and very important to follow what is discussed in the case of Ukraine. Because in a way, it can also, in terms of EU enlargement, in terms of NATO enlargement, have, I would say, an application also to your country. So also in terms of security guarantees, for example. So I think it's very, very important what takes place in Ukraine also for your country. But once again, to sum up my statement, I would say we should not overestimate, you know, the types, you know, of disparities between French declaration, German declaration, Macron declaration, Scholz declaration. I think structurally speaking, I see more, you know, a common position between France and Germany.
Thank you very much, Maxime. Before I turn to Barbara, I would like to remind our attendees that you actually can pose your question in the chat. So you can actually, put this question already, and then later we can actually try to answer this question. Barbara, as I know, you already kind of worked on German-French relations for over many years, I would say even decades. So you know both countries quite well. So what is your reading of the present situation, basically? Can we say that this is a beginning of new Eastern policy in France, or it's kind of exaggeration, and how different are the positions between Germany and France, and basically what is the outlook from your side?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation here, and these are all very important questions. But maybe let me ask let me start with the question you asked initially: the difference between Europe Puissance on the French side and the German Zeitenwende, because I think the difference really is that Europe Puissance is the formulation of an ambition. It's this idea that Europe, and this mostly means the European Union, should become a power on the international scene. And of course, this is also through this power, then that French power could be channeled also for the benefit of France. But again, this is really the formulation of an ambition for Europe and the European Union. Zeitenwende, in contrast, is, I think, purely descriptive, at least in its original meaning, namely saying, the word in German simply means a change of the times. And so this was the speech by Chancellor Scholz, me count 3 days after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, saying, well, things have fundamentally changed. Now, that maybe also tells you quite a bit of how Germany saw things before, because the sort of how radical your changes have to be after an event like that maybe also tells you something about how wrong you were before it. But I think this is the interesting thing to keep in mind, that I think France formulates ambitions, but I would not necessarily see Zeitenwende as the formulation of an ambition. And I mean, the formulation of Germany's ambition for security in Europe remain relatively vague. I mean, there's this favorite German term of responsibility, that Germany now wants to assume more responsibility. And then, I mean, in a certain way, you could probably say that it also follows through with it, for example, by especially supporting Lithuania with the permanently stationed brigades there and so on. But there is no, I would say, it is just not at the same level as the ambition that is formulated on the French side with Europe Puissance, which also, I mean, maybe is important to remember, is that Europe Puissance predates the invasion or the Ukraine war by many, many years, if not decades. That said, I completely agree with Maxime that maybe the rifts between France and Germany are overstated, on the one hand, at least. I think there still is a very deep consensus on how to read the situation in terms of who is the aggressor, what is happening. And I mean, this also explains agreements on a long list of things, that there need to be sanctions, that what Russia did is unacceptable, and that Ukraine needs to be supported. Both countries signed security agreements where I think it is important to be precise. These are not security guarantees. Nobody provides security guarantees to Ukraine at this point. These are agreements that, I'm not saying that they're not valuable, but they're not security guarantees. And in terms of support, I think both countries do a lot. I know that France especially has been criticized for not doing enough. And I know that in Paris, people are not happy with the ranking of the Kiel Institute, for example, saying that the numbers are distorted. But I think whatever you want to discuss about the details of support for Ukraine, there is an actual commitment in both capitals to support Ukraine, both bilaterally as well as through other formats, and especially, of course, the European Union. So I think in that sense, the rift is overstated, and that a number of sort of the how to say, the rifts that appear in the media, as the example that also Maxime already brought up about the ground forces in Ukraine. Again, I would not really overstate them. And I think, I mean, it's hard to add new thoughts to what Maxime already said. I would also underline this idea that there's more structural French thinking on things, and then there is what Macron says, and his initiatives. And of course, he's the president, he makes the call. But to me, sort of the increasing, maybe call it non-alignment between what the deeper or the more structural and more historically, logically, if I may put it that way, French thinking and the statements of the president is actually started with the speech in Bratislava. Which is when he gave a speech in Globsec, where he also very strongly supported EU enlargement, but where I, for the first time, had this reaction, wait a minute, this is very new. And I think the question here is, of course, is like, how deeply rooted are these changes in France, or will they just disappear when Macron leaves office after the next elections, which he will have to, because he cannot run anymore. After 2 terms. So to maybe broaden issues and respond to what you ask about European security in the East, I think what you can definitely say about this Franco-German couple or tandem is that they do not have a joint vision, really. I mean, at least if you define vision as maybe a little bit bolder thinking and conceptualizing in terms of a European security architecture, and assuming that our relations with Russia will be characterized by antagonism for the foreseeable future, then how exactly do we manage these antagonistic relations? And I think, again, Paris and Berlin really do agree that these relations are going to be antagonistic for years, probably decades to come. But then what exactly to do about this? I think they don't have a joint vision, which is not really surprising, because I doubt that Berlin or Paris have a national vision about these things either. I think right now there really is not exactly a vision. And I mean, a lot of the more military aspects of this are driven within NATO, where there's a strong focus on deterrence and building up the military posture required for that. But then this is, if you will, the defensive part of this. But in terms of the proactive part, especially on how to shape things and how to maybe try to really build this security order in the widest sense. So not just who is in NATO and who is not, but yeah, finding a vision, for example, of what do we do about the OSCE, or what are the rules of the games going to be. I think there really is no vision anywhere right now. So there's obviously not a joint one either. And I think this is one of these aspects where it's especially regrettable that there is no true strategic dialogue between France and Germany either. I mean, there's lots of meetings and so on, but I think a real strategic dialogue between France and Germany is something that still needs to emerge. Now, just to maybe end on this, on EU enlargement, I think, yes, it is absolutely true that EU enlargement, I think by now it has really sunk in sort of the existing EU membership countries, and then also France and Germany, of course, that this is also a strategic tool. And I think it took quite a bit to get to that point, to stop thinking about EU enlargement like it was usual in the 1990s. It is about limiting other actors' influence, Russia, China, and so on. But I think in the Western European debate, it is also that the focus really mostly is on the Western Balkans, on Moldova and Ukraine, unfortunately for Georgia. And I think a lot of the debates surrounding EU enlargement are also very EU internal in the sense that I think a key topic really is this enlargement reform dilemma, where it is the position, and again here France and Germany are essentially on the same page, is this idea that for the EU to be functional at 36 member states, it really needs to be reformed. And so the reform is, of course, problematic in the European debate, where it is opposed by a number of countries, mostly to the east of the EU and to the north. There's a debate about should the treaties be changed. Chancellor Scholz said in his speech in Prague when was it, August 2022, that the treaties are not set in stone. That is a rather new statement for a German chancellor. There's of course also changes to the functioning of the EU that could be made that do not require treaty changes, such as QMV and foreign policy decisions, for example. But then again, this is really not a topic without controversy within the EU. So in that sense, a lot of the strategic tool debate about how to strategically use EU enlargement in times of geostrategic competition is also mixed up with these institutional debates within the European Union. And how this can be solved, I don't know, because just a very last word about this. One lens through which I would read a number of these recent Macron statements is also an attempt to regain influence in Europe and within the European Union and NATO, with sort of having positions that are more in line with, let's say, Polish or Baltic positions. And Germany as well, I think, is really struggling from to just shortly call it reputational damage that stems from its past Russia policies and Nord Stream 2 and all these topics. And so that really opens the question of what is the weight of this duel right now in the European Union. So that, I think, is something that really remains to be seen. We'll maybe also have to wait for the European elections, because the election results, if in both countries the populists really dominate, which is not to be excluded, I think that might further complicate things for France and Germany. But yeah, to sum everything up, I think there's a lot in motion right now, and it is very difficult to have any final conclusions on pretty much any of the questions you asked.
Thank you, Barbara, for very interesting analysis. And I agree. I would say that this French posture towards Eastern Europe is, I would say, revolutionary, if you taking into consideration what was the policy before, and especially this aligning with Baltic and some other countries, something which was unexpected. Having said that, I would like to turn now to Maxime, and actually both of you, a little bit to bring closer to the region. What we see is that, of course, we don't know when the war and when the war in Ukraine will end and what will be the outcome of this. But at the same time, do you think that there's a kind of thinking already in Europe what should be done with the region? When I say region, it's kind of unclear, and I just want you to put here the kind of more clear picture. What is the region? Is it Eastern Partnership or is it the Black Sea? Because these are kind of two kind of region. And also what I see is that, for instance, United States, Barbara mentioned that there's a lack of vision and there's a competition also between the great powers. We have a Chinese influence, some other illiberal powers here. At the same time, we see that the United States has some sort of vision towards Black Sea. US Congress already, actually worked on the Black Sea strategy. At the same time, what we see is that if you look to the EU, the last document about Black Sea, Black Sea Synergy, which was adopted long time ago, and even academic literature about Black Sea is missing. At the same time, let's imagine if the war is over, what will the future of this region? Because will it stay like gray zone like it was before, which I don't think that Europe can afford, because Black Sea security is already, at least this is how we see it from the region, is part of the European security, because future of Ukraine is not just about region, but it's also kind of intertwined with European security. And how do you see, is there any kind of vision from France, Germany, or generally from EU, what should be done about the region, especially in terms of Black Sea security, how to ensure this, because we all remember the European Union was dealing with the Black Sea kind of like, neighboring sea, which is kind of important, but it's not really kind of vital for EU's interest. Do you see that there's some sort of changes? And Maxim, I would like to ask you maybe to start with this, and then we will go, actually, we already have some questions, and we will try to answer these questions. Floor is yours.
So I'm not aware, but I'm not anymore in the ministry. You know, I am teaching international relations in the SCP, so I'm now more in the academic background. But I didn't hear about new reflections about Black Sea. I remember when I was in COEST, it was a long time ago, this Black Sea synergy. I perfectly remember it was an interest also for countries like Greece, for example, but of course also Romania, Bulgaria. It was very good in a time where there were some kind of cooperation with Russia. Now we have a situation where Black Sea will probably be a NATO against Russia. You know, we are building a new military base in Romania. There is a war in Ukraine where, you know, Ukraine is able to weaken the Black Sea fleet of Russia. So I see more, you know, Black Sea as a territory of confrontation between NATO and Russia, and the same for the Black Sea, for the Baltic Sea. So I'm not aware of a specific, you know, Black Sea strategy, and I don't see how a Black Sea strategy could really, you know, solve some issues. What France has proposed, which was quite new, is a European political community. You know, it was a proposal of Macron to make a new forum for all Europe, except Russia, except Belarus. So in reality, the European political community, it's the same as the Council of Europe, but we didn't want to use the Council of Europe. So we made a new specific forum, which has regional meetings. You know, I think the next summit will be in London, I think, if I heard well. So this is an area where we can, you know, reinforce the relation between the EU and the different members of the European political community, which are not members of the EU. It includes Britain, it includes Caucasus countries, it includes Turkey. So maybe the European political community can be a kind of political framework. The difficulty is that it's you know, it's a framework which is a Western-oriented framework, oriented to our values, to our integration models, etc. And of course, the difficulty is to how are we going to cope with what Barbara justly said, a very antagonistic relation with Russia for the years to come. And the European political community can be only one part of this, you know, because we have to use NATO to military deterrence, security agreements. So it's not, I fully agree with Barbara, it's not security guarantee. The agreement with Ukraine is called security cooperation with Ukraine. So it's not, it's a security cooperation, it's a support to the security of the neighbors, but it cannot be a security guarantee. And with a hostile relation with Russia, I'm afraid that the countries which will be neighbors from Russia will still remain in a very difficult security position.
Thank you. Barbara, what is your thought on the same question?
Yes, again, I mean, I completely agree with Maxime, and maybe let me start with the question you asked, what is the region? And I think my answer will unfortunately have to be nobody really knows. There is, I mean, obviously the Black Sea region is a region that is relatively narrowly defined, but sort of anything east of the EU, what the region is, I'm not sure there really are definitions or sort of concepts that are operationalized. I think the agreement is that the region is not Russia and not Belarus, and that is about it. I think then it also depends slightly on who you talk to and what context you are in. I think within the NATO context, for example, there will be much clearer ideas on what the Black Sea region is than in different contexts. So again, I think this is all very vague and still in flux. And I think the European Union, or I mean Europe, however defined as also the capitals of the countries that are members in the European Union, I think that there really is also, there is at this point, I would say, agreement that something needs to be done, but then what that something exactly is relatively unclear. And then you have like these sub debates of this about what should we do with the Western Balkans? What should we do with the Black Sea region? And I mean, Black Sea also, I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that also within NATO, Turkey is widely viewed as a problem. And I mean, I am in Sweden, and I mean, if you follow the Swedish NATO accession saga, I think it is very hard to say that Turkey is as constructive an ally as you would maybe wish. So there are all these factors, but I think in a sense they're all approached in very individualistic takes, and there is no idea on any regional approach of anything that is east of the EU. And of course the Eastern Partnership sometimes is on the fore, but I also don't feel that it still has the same salience in the thinking and in terms of how valuable it is seen as an instrument as it maybe used to be. But maybe Maxime, who's based in Paris, also has thoughts on this.
Thank you, Barbara, for this very interesting remarks. And I also would like to mention that at the same time, it kind of contradicts what we hear from the Brussels. When Brussels, actually, the leaders, the EU leaders, they're mentioning that about geopolitical Europe. And that, you know, and if EU wants to be geopolitical, then it should act accordingly, right? So this time when Eastern Partnership was just part of neighborhood is over. So I think we need now to involve this part of the world in pan-European, I don't know, strategic dialogue on some other things which, okay, we understand that these countries maybe will not be able to influence this, you know, strategic talks on about European future, but they should be part of this strategic dialogue. And so it means that there should be some sort of vision about the region, whatever region is. I understand that for you, maybe it's not comfortable to take, you know, Black Sea as a kind of unit of analysis because there's a two illiberal country, Russia and Turkey, and probably it's not, you know, like comfortable zone, unlike, for instance, Eastern Europe, but even in Eastern neighborhood, we have Belarus and, you know, same, you know, like with Russia. So I think this is definitely one of the problems. Having said that, I would like now to turn to the questions from the audience, and basically I would ask, you can also read this question, but I will read it for you as well. There's a one question from Badri Kochoradze. Does Western strategy rest not on the direct military confrontation with Russia, but the stimulation of would-be political instability within Russia? If so, does the West have a strategy on how to deal with large-scale political instability, even civil war in Russia? And I will read also another question, which is also related to this, is that how can Russia be defeated if Ukraine is deprived of the possibility to hit the military infrastructure, including the military industry inside the Russian territory? Maybe I will read also one question also related to the same topic. How do France and Germany see the future of so-called Kaliningrad district and Suwalki corridor against the ongoing full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia? Maybe I'll just read this one and then I will read another one. So maybe we can now reverse and we can start from Barbara and then Maxime.
Thank you. These are complicated questions. Let me try to go in the order. So avoiding direct confrontation with Russia is the absolute key objective of, I would say, the West in general, not just France and Germany, of course. And also because, I mean, you do have nuclear powers involved there, Russia, obviously, but also on the Western side, I mean, three of them in NATO. So the risk of escalation, I think, is what drives this, or not drives this, but what is always there in the background, and what I think is also much more present, if you will, in the Western parts of Western Europe, to put it that way, than you would maybe have it in the Polish or Baltic discourses, where this take on the risk for escalation is maybe a bit different. So the second part of the question, if I remember correctly, was about stimulating political unrest in Russia. And there I would have to say no. I do not think that anybody in the West is actively trying to stimulate political unrest in Russia. But the fears that unrest in Russia might happen is, of course, there, again, without stimulation from the West, but unrest can also happen for domestic reasons, right? And I don't think anybody has any recipes for what to do then. I mean, that is definitely a very scary scenario, but I think that's as far as the analyst goes now. I mean, maybe some people have the hope that after unrest of whatever kind in Russia, you might have a leadership in Russia that is more open to dialogue, but then others say, and that's personally what I believe too, is that it's more likely that this will not improve the situation at all and just make everything much more dangerous. How Ukraine can win the war if it's not provided with the right weapons? Again, I mean, this is obviously widely debated in our part of Europe as well, but I think the red line again for a lot of sort of positions within Western Europe is that a direct conflict with Russia must be avoided at all costs, mostly because of the risk of escalation up to a nuclear war that is really there. And I mean, if in case this question also referred to the German debate about the Taurus missiles, I can only say what the Chancellor says is the reason. So again, this is mostly just the not delivering it is justified, according to the Chancellor, by the risk for escalation. And I mean, there's also information that has leaked from a defense committee meeting that it would also put Germany in a military complicated situation if it had to give these systems to Ukraine and could not use them itself. But the sort of more broadly, the question of how to militarily or how to support Ukraine with military equipment is, of course, very, very high on European or EU agendas and national capitals. There are initiatives like the Czech one now to fund ammunition. I heard simply on the radio this morning, on the French radio, that also in France, there are ideas of just forcing the French national industry to actually produce more ammunition under some kind of war regulations. So this issue is on the agenda, and I think that's really all I can say about this at this point. Kaliningrad and the Suwalki gap. I think, well, Kaliningrad is going to be there, and I think it will mostly be seen as a major security risk, not least because of tactical nuclear weapons stationed there. But I do think in general that the perception is that, especially with Sweden and Finland joining NATO, and now the fact that the entire Baltic Sea region can be seen as a holistic area from a NATO perspective, and then also Gotland, you know, this island in the Baltic Sea is now a NATO island, take some of the pressure out there of sort of making it harder for Russia to establish these access denial bubbles, HUAD bubbles in the Baltic Sea. And the same, I think, also applies to the Suwalki Gap, is that now it's really the only passageway for Russia to the Western Europe, now that, again, Finland and Sweden are members of NATO. So I think on these two issues, the latest NATO accessions actually take a little bit of the pressure out. But I mean, of course, Kaliningrad is going to remain a security problem from a Western perspective.
Thank you, Barbara. And maybe since we have just 10 minutes left until the end of the session, maybe I will read a few questions also for Maxime. Maybe you can actually choose from the previous one as well as new one. So there's a question from Frauke Siebers from the GAP. Basically, she's asking what can be added value of the European political community as long as EU remains internally divided and often blocked in foreign policy decision. And second one is from Vladimir Tokacic. How realistic do you think that EU's future or EU future of Georgia? You mentioned that NATO accession is unlikely due to the two occupied regions. Do you think even the case of your positive answer, the EU is ready for another Cyprus, or would the EU expect Georgia to open another chapter 35 in potential future accession negotiations, as in case of Serbia regarding Kosovo? So Maxime, floor is yours.
So I don't know if I can answer all questions. I would say I think it's not excluded that we enlarge to some countries without full territorial integrity. Maybe it's easier for EU for example, to accept Georgia than for NATO. Because if NATO accepts Georgia, you know, and recognize in a way that Abkhazia and South Ossetia are not controlled by Georgia, it's a bit a contradiction, you know. So I think it's more difficult to solve than for Cyprus or Georgia. So I don't think it's a real big problem for at least for EU. Regarding the European political community, it's true that the EU can be divided, but in the case of this all this issue of the Ukraine war, there was a very strong unity. A common approach of interest, a common policy. So the EU can be very much divided, for example, regarding the Israel-Gaza war. This is a real difficult issue. But regarding the position towards Russia, Ukraine, etc., it's very clear, it seems to me. The question, of course, is what is going to happen when, if, for example, there are some political changes in the US in the end of this year. And then, of course, maybe France is a bit more ambitious, you know, in the idea of having a powerful Europe able to support Ukraine against Russia, even without the US. So it's, I would say, it's a bit the position that President Macron wants to take. I'm not the impression, but maybe Barbara can complement that the Germans would be so happy about that. So this is a big question for the future, of course. And I must say, sometimes it's difficult to find in the speeches of our political leaders a very clear strategy, you know, about what is going to happen, what are the scenarios, etc. What we say is that Russia should not win. We must support Ukraine. Of course, NATO must defend itself. But this being said, and we see also, for example, in the pre-Georgian crisis, that there is a bit some caution in Western capitals about what could happen if there is political instability in Russia. So I'm not sure it's a scenario which rises enthusiasm, you know. So I think very much remains open for the future. In reality, it will depend on the situation on the ground. It will depend on what happens in the US. It will also depend on what the reaction of the EU will be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And maybe since we have a few minutes left, just there's two more questions very briefly. One question is from Gebhard Reul. He's asking about, he says that Chancellor Scholz is more cautious about Russia than Macron because he's still convinced that post-Putin Russia would be important for the European security architecture. What do you think about this opinion? And then Mikhail Sarjoladze is asking, to what extent can combination of Georgian government's passive foreign policy towards key partners, such as Germany and France, and this ideological rapprochement with alliance of authoritarian states influence EU and NATO integration in the long term? Yeah, there's also one question about where's the debate on increasing military budget and production in EU. Giga Bokhari asking this question. Maybe very briefly, since we don't have time, maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes each of you. Barbara, maybe we can start from you.
Okay, thank you. Well, for the first question, all I can say is I don't know what Chancellor Scholz really thinks. But the future of the European security order will very much be tied to Russia. I mean, you can have a relationship even if you don't talk, right? So I mean, Russia will be there. There will be a need to do something about it and maybe with it. But what the real thinking is I don't know. All I can say is that German rhetoric does not point in the direction of this statement, especially also if you look at the foreign ministry. Let me see the other questions. Maybe just as a broad answer to the last question before I hand over to Maxime is also, I think one of the biggest fears in the EU is to get another Hungary with any enlargement in any country. And so this probably is something to really keep in mind also when talking about alliances of liberal democracies and so on, is that another Hungary is something the EU really does not want and probably also cannot afford. And so this, I think, will mean that the insistence of criteria related to this will only go up in any kind of negotiations or thinking about enlargements.
Maxime?
Yes, I very much agree with that. What Barbara said, she already said that the issue of the EU reform will be very important, and it will influence the debate on enlargement. So how will be the EU itself politically sustainable, with which kind of majority in the European Parliament? The question of the rule of law, of illiberal governments, it will still be a big question. But once again, we can also deal with some question in the European political community, not only in the EU and the EU enlargement debate. I don't know also what Chancellor Scholz really thinks, and I think, but it's true that for me, it cannot be satisfying to think that there will be a permanent war against Russia. I mean, at the point we need to imagine other options or possibilities, because otherwise it will not be good for the security of Europe, in particular of the gray zone, as you say, in Eastern Europe. So we need to think about many options. And regarding military budget and production, it's underway. There are a lot of efforts which have been done. I think the question of the development of European defense industry, etc., it's a real challenge for the future, for the next legislative period. We have already done a lot, and it will continue.
Thank you very much, Barbara and Maxime, for this very interesting, conversation. I think, as I mentioned, we need this more and more, this kind of talks, especially to this part of the world, especially to 3 countries, so-called associated countries, who we consider sometimes like strategic orphans, because they were like a long time there. But now, as these countries are kind of part of accession, and some of them are candidate countries, probably what we need is to a little bit more involve them in this dialogue, especially in pan-European affairs related to security, foreign policy, and everything. Because especially, not only young people, because I see that is going with the Erasmus and many other things, but also some other part, because what we lack is this societal contacts. We have contacts on intergovernmental level between governments, but that's not enough. We need to a little bit more engage with each other, because this is going to be part of whatever we call this future of Europe. So I think this kind of discussion and probably maybe debates would somehow facilitate more integration of this region to the European Union. Having said that, of course, I understand that there was more questions. We could not answer all of them, unfortunately. But this is just beginning of this conversation. And as a Georgian Institute of Politics, I can say that we will try to continue this conversation because we found it quite interesting. Thank you very much again for both speakers and for attendees for the interest, and stay tuned. And we will try to continue this kind of discussion, which facilitates some sort of dialogue between Eastern Partnership countries, including Georgia and the EU. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.